Welcome back to our PPE in a Time of Pandemic discussion series. Today, I'm very delighted to be joined by Professors Briana Toole of Claremont McKenna College and William Paris of Northwestern University. And we're going to talk about protests, civil disobedience, and resistance. Welcome, Briana and Will. So Briana, if I can start with you, you've recently completed a paper that I think some of our audience will have already read, entitled Holding Resistance Hostage, in which you identify and analyze a family of rhetorical strategies that are deployed in response to acts of resistance and protest. And these are strategies that are commonly used to disrupt and render attempts at resistance inefficacious. You term these strategies undermining strategies. Now, in the paper, one of the things that you do that I really appreciate is give instantly familiar examples of these strategies in operation. So I'd like to talk a little bit about these undermining strategies. Maybe you could tell us about the 4 species that you identify and tell us where our audience might encounter them.
Yes, so just, I want to start, I think, by giving a bit of background on undermining and situating the phenomenon in relation to how it undermines the aims of resistance. And to do that, I think we have to take a moment to reflect on what resistance is supposed to do. I think you should kind of hate it. I think it's meant to be inconvenient. I think it's meant to disrupt. It's meant to shock, jar, alarm, because the very nature of resistance is that it's drawing your attention to something that perhaps you have witnessed every day, but don't think of as particularly remarkable. So it's supposed to make salient certain features that you sort of take for granted as just part of the norm. And so the worry that I have about undermining is that it prevents that sort of disruption from happening. It's a way of escaping the confrontation that resistance demands. And so undermining abounds. I identify 4 species in the paper, but these are by no means an exhaustive list. So some that you might be familiar with are whataboutism. So I say something like, police brutality is terrible. So many innocent Black people are being murdered at the hands of police officers. And you say, well, what about Black on Black crime? And the purpose there is to avoid discussing the systemic issue that police brutality presents, and instead focusing on something that's not relevant remotely to the conversation. Because in protesting, Black Lives Matter isn't just objecting to the loss of Black life to court, it's responding to the loss of Black life at the hands of people who were meant to safeguard society and us as individuals. So I think that's a pretty common tactic that we see. But yet another, and this one will be even more prevalent and at the top of our heads, because right now the NFL is trying to apologize without apologizing directly. So here I'm thinking Colin Kaepernick. Colin Kaepernick started taking a knee during the national anthem when it was played at football games. And he was very vocal about the fact that he was doing this to draw attention to police brutality. And yet, the way it got discussed in the media and framed in the media and taken up by many conservatives is, oh, this is an attack on American values. This is an attack on our national anthem, on our flag, on what it means to be an American. And so I call that misdirection. It's sort of a sleight of hand that's meant to discombobulate almost, and to get you to think that the resistance is about something that it's not, so that you have a justifiable right to be offended. How dare you insult this country that my forefathers fought for? When really what's happening in the Kaepernick protest is that we're trying to draw attention to this very particular issue that affects Black Americans. Now, the other 2 are perhaps a little less explicit. And I think that's because many audiences find some aspect of what I'm about to discuss pretty appealing or convincing. So the 3rd species that I identify is appropriation. So I think we're familiar with to some extent with appropriation, the idea that you're stealing some other person's culture and appropriating it as your own. But here I have in mind a rhetorical or conceptual theft. We say Black Lives Matter, and it's a powerful assertion because it means that despite everything that you see, despite everything that Black people endure, despite everything we're told, our lives have value and they matter. But then you take that slogan and you use it and corrupt it to make it all lives matter or blue lives matter. And again, that distracts from the main topic of conversation, But the reason that I think it's particularly pernicious is because, just like cultural appropriation, it punishes the group responsible for originating the phrase while simultaneously allowing the new powerful group to use it without punishment. For the record, Blue Lives Matter successfully advocated in the state of Louisiana to make acts against police officers hate crimes. So they've been remarkably successful in their endeavors, whereas we're only just now seeing Black Lives Matter get the same level of success that Blue Lives Matter has already had, even though they were developed after the fact. And then lastly, the one that's most pernicious to me, and this will come up again later in the conversation, is stereotype confirmation. I think this one's really damaging. And this really is what led me to call the paper Holding Resistance Hostage, because I wanted to capture the feeling that a person must have when they're held hostage, this powerlessness that you feel when you know that there is no option left to you. So we protest, and then we're called animals, we're called thugs, we're called looters, we're called far worse than I'm going to mention in the course of this talk. And that's intentional language that's designed so as to delegitimize the movement and what we're doing. If you focus exclusively on riots and looting, and then you say, look, they are criminals, this is why they're in jail, this is why cops killed them, then you have found a way that's legible to you to make the protest the sort of thing that's unnecessary. Because, well, if Black people just comply with police orders, if Black people just acted respectably, then they wouldn't get killed. And so this form of undermining is particularly dangerous because it suggests that there's some right way to do protesting, when we know, via Colin Kaepernick, via Martin Luther King, that there is no way of performing protest that's going to be amenable to the people who are benefited by the status quo. So that's the sort of phenomenon that I'm trying to identify within the paper.
Great, thank you. So let's talk a little bit more about appropriation. Because when I was reading your paper, I was really fascinated by that section, and I was struck by the thought that, in a way, this is the most nefarious species of undermining that you identify, because it involves taking all of the energy and the work that activists have contributed to a movement and perverting it, in effect, right? Diverting it to a different goal that a dominant group finds acceptable. And somehow that struck me as especially morally troubling. But I'm still not sure that I can defend the claim that appropriation is morally worse than the other strategies, right? They're repugnant as well. But there's something very interesting about it, because it strikes me as kind of more political. It aims at some change in the world, whereas the other undermining strategies function to constrain and frustrate the ability of activists to achieve any change at all. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how it stands in relation to the others, and whether there's any particular strategy that you find especially troubling, either on political or moral grounds, and why.
Yes, so the forms that I identify are meant to escalate in harm as I introduce a new one into the common ground. So I definitely think of stereotype confirmation being the worst, whataboutism sort of being the least harmful. And that's because I can sort of see what about Black crime being the kind of question that someone naive is asking as they begin to unpack these issues. But stereotype confirmation and appropriation function within this broader frame within which Black communications just don't make any sense. Because our resources, the language that we use to understand our world, the concepts that we have to make sense of the things that we see, have been shaped by a white imagination. And so what I take appropriation and stereotype confirmation to demonstrate is that people are still operating within and understanding statements within that white frame. I do think appropriation is particularly harmful for the reasons that I outlined earlier. Just something about the theft and the knowledge that you're going to come up with this slogan that's going to be really powerful for uniting people, and then it is absolutely destroyed in the media and in personal discussions. And then after it's been, just demolished, then other groups, the people that you were speaking to, are going to take your slogan and corrupt it for their own insidious purposes. So I think there is something really harmful about seeing your labor contorted in that way. But the one that really strikes me as something that I just find personally difficult to grapple with is stereotype confirmation. So, I mean, to be honest, this stereotype confirmation is why I wrote the paper. It was the very first section that I started on. So I don't know how many of you have read the book Black Like Me by John Howard Griffin. He was a white reporter who wanted to understand what life was like for Black Americans under Jim Crow in the South. And so he took the medicine that they prescribed for vitiligo that evens your skin tone, and that was used to darken his skin, and he, you know, shaved his hair to present a more Black appearance. And he talks a lot about the Black experience in his book, but one of the things that struck me as the most upsetting is he described taking a journey from New Orleans to Hattiesburg, Mississippi on a bus, and at a scheduled rest stop, the driver let all of the white passengers off, but wouldn't let any of the Black passengers deboard, and said, "I'm not going to be responsible for rounding you animals up." And so they get back on the bus and they really need to go to the bathroom. And so they're like, screw it. You know what? We'll just flood the bus. If they won't let us use the bathroom, we'll just make the bus our toilet. But then another older Black gentleman speaks up and says, no, we can't do that, because they'll just take it to confirm what they already think about us. They'll say that we're stupid animals who didn't even know how to use the bathroom. And they'll never, ever mention that we weren't even allowed to get off the bus in the first place. And I think that's what I found shocking, the realization that there is nothing that you can do within the system as constructed to challenge or resist your oppression, because every action that you take is going to be perceived through the white gaze. And the white gaze has been constructed so as to see Blacks as inherently criminal and stupid. That sense of powerlessness is what I think makes the work of organizing resistance and protest so hard and demoralizing, because you know before you even undertake this action that this is one of the roadblocks you're going to face.
Thank you, Briana. Maybe we can give Briana a break and I could get you to jump in here. So I wonder whether you can think of examples that you've come across in your historical work of the undermining phenomena, or like attempts to theorize the undermining phenomena that Briana describes. And maybe, I wonder whether you have a view about which of these strategies, or indeed any others that you want to adduce, right? Because Briana said her account isn't exhaustive. We should be most wary of as political actors in this moment.
So how I want to approach this question, because I agree with absolutely everything that Briana said, is to remind everyone of the holiday that is going on right now, Juneteenth. As I was preparing for this meeting, I reread Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" And I'm thinking that question needs to be updated. What we should be asking is, what to America is Juneteenth? Because what Frederick Douglass is asking is, he's asking, how do we fit into this nation? He is asking, how does our project of freedom and emancipation, how can we live up to what you all have called this free nation that was supposed to, create a new world order? But now what we should be asking is, perhaps America doesn't fit into our vision of freedom. That, go back to Briana's language of, frames and paradigms. One way appropriation happens is making it seem as if every movement towards utopia, and we can talk a little bit more about utopia in a bit, what I mean by that, must always adhere to this pre-existing narrative that this is about making America better. But if utopia, there's something deeply spatial about utopia. Let's not forget the ambivalent meaning of utopia is the good place and nowhere, but it's always somewhere else. And so a way of appropriating utopia, demanding something more, is to say, no, you don't need to go anywhere else. Your space of freedom is here and has been here all along. And so we should be asking if America can make a home for this unfinished project of Juneteenth. Perhaps we've outgrown America. And so I actually find it interesting, one of the sort of critiques of Colin Kaepernick that Briana mentioned is, how can you attack this country? My father died for this country. Well, I want to ask a couple of things. A country or a nation is not some mystical entity. It must constantly be recreated, challenged. And if it is no longer useful for the project of freedom, we don't live for the nation, we live for freedom. And if the nation doesn't, support our freedom, then perhaps we need to go elsewhere. And so one of the strategies of appropriation, I find, is to make it seem as if we're all on the same page and this is all about the founding fathers. I want to ask, when can we have done with the founding fathers, with these presidents who had the teeth of slaves in their mouths? And are they really the incarnation of utopia that we are looking for? Another way that appropriation happens that I think about historically in my work is the way that Black political agency is obscured. How we are taught that the freedom of the slaves was Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. No. Many slaves fought and died for their self-determination, but I am struck by how often this country, and if I'm going to be honest, many white people who even want to be in solidarity are deeply uncomfortable with Black political agency, centering it and asking, well, maybe this isn't the frame we want to live by. And so the way appropriation happens often in the current context is when these movements of utopia happen, it becomes about reform. It becomes about, no, 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 no. When they say defund the police, what they really mean is a kinder police. No, what is meant is what character of society do we have wherein the police are constantly thought of as the only answer to social problems? And so we need to challenge that. We need to be willing to say that perhaps we want a new configuration of life, and that, this new configuration of life, there is deep historical roots for this, and I'll end my response with this so we can get to other questions. But has deep historical roots, because one might say if we have done the founding fathers, then it's chaos. We need history in order to orient ourselves. And to that I say two things. One, does this look like order to you? And two, what's so specific about African-American history is there is another historical tradition here. It's often distorted, mutilated, forgotten, but projects of freedom, you can find them going all the way back to David Walker, Frederick Douglass, Mariah Stewart. You wouldn't be completely lost. And so what are you holding on to? What do they bring, i.e. the founding fathers, this idea of America, that wasn't brought to the table by these people demanding a truly social and common society? And so what I want to end with is, I wonder if part of this is why people are so deeply uncomfortable with conversations around Black nationalism. There have been many varieties of it, and it's usually been stereotyped as violent, as conservative, and some forms were. But I could perhaps say more. Malcolm X actually had a very different understanding of Black nationalism near the end of his life, but unfortunately he died too soon to fully lay it out.
Thank you. And actually, if it's all right with you, Will, I want to talk to you a bit about your book manuscript. So one of the really interesting historical developments that you chart in this manuscript, which is provisionally titled Black Critical Theory and the Practice of Utopia, is the emergence of Black critical theory as a distinct philosophical tradition. In your account, its emergence as an autonomous sphere of intellectual activity is conditioned in part by social discrimination and by the attenuated access that Black intellectuals are granted to other spaces of cultural production. And these are themes you've already touched on. The philosophers in this tradition develop really interesting relationships to what you term utopian thought. So maybe you could talk a little bit about this tradition and about its relationship to utopian thought. And I know that there are some students in the audience, so maybe you could start by telling us what utopias are, and then why you think utopian theorizing has played such a central role in Black critical theory, especially in the United States.
Thank you. I do want to begin by this, because I am actually, the way that I understand utopia is a bit off the beaten path. Originally, I wanted to do something called concept creation, basically be like, the way other people talk about utopia, no, it's this way. But that was a hard sell because people have a really sedimented idea in their mind of what utopia is. So the reason why I pick utopia is, one, there's a specific philosophical question that arises whenever you talk about utopia, which is why I think a lot of people are antagonistic towards it, which is when you look at a given utopia, whether it's a literary utopia, whether it's people saying a society without cops, is the question of, is that actually possible? Is that impossible? So utopia imminently necessarily generates the philosophical question, whether it's epistemological, hermeneutical, or political, about differentiating between logical possibility and real possibility. Logical possibility is, sure, we can come up with an image of a society wherein clouds are made of cotton candy. No one, at least as far as I know about scientific technology, that's not a real possibility. But what's interesting is, when you're talking about the African-American tradition, we'll stay with that, but I deal with figures outside the African-American tradition, like Fanon and Sylvia Wynter, is that there was a moment when abolition was pure logical possibility, that it was impossible, unimaginable until it happened. And so for me, what utopia allows me to talk about is, we too often think of utopia as purely intellectual activity. but actually utopia is generated from material situations of deprivation and violence, of people struggling and demanding a different type of organization of the world. No utopia is, like solves all social problems. I think that's the other thing that people expect of utopia, but they miss even historically. That was never what utopia is meant to do. Utopia is meant to reorganize our approach to the world such that maybe new social problems arise. And so utopia in practice, when slaves would flee from plantations, engage in revolts and all that, that's the practice of utopia insofar as they are presupposing a world in which they are free, but it's not yet here. And so they convert what seemed like mere logical possibility into real possibility. And so I want to think utopia from the ground up, not from the top down, not from like what Black intellectuals might say, this is what the perfect society looks like, but look at real existing social movements and how they start to bring about possibilities that we didn't even know could be thought about. In this current juncture with defund the police, all of a sudden a new terrain is opened up to us of different practices and different ways of speaking about the society. And that work has been going on for a very long time, but now it's breaking through. Now, all of a sudden, that doesn't seem like mere logical possibility. And so my understanding of utopia it arises from imminent situations in which something is missing, in which we need to go elsewhere. It's not about the perfect place. It's about actually withdrawing legitimacy from the current state of affairs and investing elsewhere. And that's why I think utopias, whether it's Marinage communities of slaves and all of that, whether it's Black Wall Street in Tulsa, whether it's Black enclaves, whether it's COINTELPRO destroying the Black Panthers, spying on MLK and Malcolm X, are deeply disruptive because they say the governing order no longer has legitimacy, and it tries to accord legitimacy where it had always belonged, with the people. And so what's distinctive about the African-American tradition is it's always been buffeted by these two forces between integration and separation. And the figure of the Black nation gets caught on these contradictions. And the reason why I talk about the Black nation, not to say that any existing protocol of Black nationalism I defend, but what's specifically utopic about it is there literally is not a Black nation on any map. Like, every Black nationalist, they were saying this is something wholly new we'd be creating. And so it completely changes the geography of what's possible. And I want to just end with Malcolm X's understanding that Black nationalism was not about people with Black skin. It was about those engaged in anti-colonial projects, whether they were in Latin America, Asia, Africa, and he even turns to white people. And he says, if you believe in human rights, you believe in the Black nation. You need to get out of your frame of thinking the only legitimacy is America, when America has shown itself to be a failed state.
Thank you. So I guess maybe we can move from utopianism, however qualified, to Briana's brand of cold hard realism, with which I'm familiar. So Briana, because I think this is really, this is a kind of like interesting tension between your thought and Will's thought on this subject. Because you end your paper holding resistance hostage on a relatively pessimistic note. And I hope you don't mind me sharing with our audience the fact that in an earlier version of the paper, the title wasn't holding resistance hostage, it was the even more bleak, resistance is futile. So why do you think it's important to emphasize the difficulty of succeeding in programs of resistance, especially where undermining strategies are in play?
There's a two-pronged answer here, and let's see if I can remember the second part of the answer as I'm giving the first. So yes, the paper was originally called Resistance is Futile, mostly because I wanted to get in a Star Wars reference. And then I decided I wanted to do more to communicate the feeling that you have when you're undertaking protest and resistance. So partially, this was motivated for an academic concern. There's this recent spate of literature advocated by people like Carol Hay, Daniel Silvermint, that suggests that the oppressed have a duty to resist their oppression. And my thought was, if you're going to tell me I have some sort of obligation, I want to know what it is that thwarts my capacity to fulfill that obligation. And so I wanted to suggest that the way that things are set up politically and socially, and I go on to say epistemically in the United States, is such that political resistance just isn't possible for Black people. The conditions just aren't there, or they're such that it's exceedingly difficult to do it and to do it effectively. And so I wanted to sort of think through all of the things that present an obstacle to the fulfillment of this obligation. But another reason I wanted to do it is because I'm an epistemologist. I study what we know and what structures affect what and how we know and what we don't know. And we're often looking at, in resistance, making political changes or social changes. But I think the truth is that those are just the wrong spots to be working. I think we need epistemic changes. I think we need ideological changes. And let's just take this current moment as an illustration. I assure you, we do not care about Aunt Jemima. Yeah, when I was 5, I realized that there was something wrong with Aunt Jemima, but changing syrup does nothing to change the fundamental conditions of my life as a Black woman in this country. So I don't care about you changing Aunt Jemima, and I don't care that much about you pulling down statues. What I want is your textbooks to be radically altered. I want you to end your contracts with these people that are now trying to change the language of slavery to describe us as migrants, as if we willingly chose to get on a ship, packed with hundreds of other people, and come across an ocean on a trip that took 4 months, and to sleep and sit in our shit and filth all day. I want a radical change in the epistemic conditions that make it possible for resistance to be disrupted and corrupted and destroyed in the ways that they are in the white mind. I want prisons to be abolished. I want the police to be defunded. I want real changes, but I don't think those real changes are going to happen until we start to really critically interrogate the myths that we tell our children from the moment they go to school to the moment they graduate with their PhD. And so thinking about it from this perspective was, for me, an opportunity to show how the very way that we've been educated makes it almost impossible for Black people to effectively implement resistance and protest. Because for people who have not begun to develop their racial identity or their understanding of how race still structures how we interact in this country, then things just aren't going to get done. We'll continue to have these symbolic changes that don't mean anything and don't change the material conditions of the lives of most Black people in this country.
Thank you. So maybe we can move here to Will. So Will, in your book manuscript, you argue that the uprisings that we've seen in recent years in response to police violence and economic inequality, so uprisings in Ferguson and more recently in Baltimore, Atlanta, New York, Minneapolis, as well as many other major cities, that these can be viewed as utopian practices that are aimed at creating and realizing new social forms, maybe against the very tendencies that Briana is elucidating. So perhaps you could walk us through how one of the central collective actors in these developments, the Black Lives Matter movement, can be understood in these terms, and then maybe we can get you, both in conversation about that.
Yes. So I want to begin the same way I began last time, that I absolutely agree with everything that Briana said. And so, I want to be clear, maybe this might come up a little bit later. On the question of optimism or pessimism, I almost read Utopia outside that, because if I were to calculate what is to happen, I am not optimistic. I will say that. But what I do want to point to talk a little bit about Black Lives Matter, but then I want to build on some of what Briana said, because I think I'm in the same headspace, is that whether we calculate whether things will happen or not, my argument about Utopia is that things break through. Now, I'll talk a little bit about one of the chapters of my book on Fanon and the radio. So he describes the radio as this cultural colonial instrument that Algerians were not interested in buying, because it was simply a way of subjugating their knowledge practices, their cultural practices, and all of that. But then when the revolution comes, and all of a sudden, over the radio are, reports of battles happening in the West and the East, a new consciousness emerges, and all of a sudden Algerians can't get enough of the radio. The French realize what's happening at this point, so they start jamming the signal. And so then the Algerians are listening to the static, listening for news. And when nothing comes through, you might think that they're like, nothing. But instead they go, it turns out we're winning in the West. And Fanon calls this a true lie. And he actually calls it, he describes this like a deeply democratic moment where they start deliberating about how they're winning. And I want to stay with that language of the true lie. That, when Black Lives Matter erupts and says, Black Lives Matter, it's a true lie. We live in a society in which they do not matter, but we have to start practicing and acting and engaging in ways as if they do, as if we already live in the configuration of the world where it is just, a known fact, a lived reality. And so when Black Lives Matter erupted, I imagine it was shocking to a lot of white people, but we're noticing a public opinion change right now. Who knows if that will hold on? I agree, there are reasons to be cynical, but there are also reasons to say that this moment is quite different with the constellation of the economic downturn, coronavirus, and a lot of young people. I'm gesturing towards another colleague of mine over in Germany who says a lot of young people are seeing that their futures were stolen. And it seems as if now Black Lives Matter, it seems as if when Black lives don't matter, wait, your life won't matter much either. And it might take longer, but the fire, as James Baldwin talked about the fire next time, it'll catch up to you. And so what happens when, especially, and I'm caught by that image of the burning police station in Minneapolis, that was a utopic practice insofar as it was as if it was saying, what if another world is possible? What if the police, the symbol of legitimacy and order, is no longer this legitimacy, is no longer order, that we will not be tied to them anymore. And so there's in this moment, there's this sort of autonomy that of course is frustrated, and there's all this static and interference, and you have the Black elite class saying, no, this is what Black people really mean, which is another form of appropriation, by the way. I believe Olufemi Tewo in Georgetown calls it, elite capture. I think that's quite prescient. But, we have to be willing to listen to the static and not just talk about, but live as if this world is different. Because again, things are impossible until they become possible. And so much of this is getting ready for those moments. And that's why I return to this idea of it's a practice. You'll never know when the material conditions are such, when the logical becomes the real, and you gotta go.
Great, so thank you. So you mentioned the coronavirus in describing the context that we find ourselves in this political moment, and maybe this is a question for both of you. So as you know, this conversation is taking part as an episode in a series entitled Philosophy, Politics and Economics in a Time of Pandemic. And the current social resistance movements have arisen during a time of serious public health crisis. So perhaps you could each say a little bit about what you see as the particular political and maybe even moral significance of engaging in struggle, protest, and resistance during a pandemic.
So there are two things that I think that are interesting about this moment. And I want to say, I tweeted this, I was first and other people started tweeting it and got more famous. Okay, not fair. But here's the thing to think about. We now know that Black people are being infected with COVID at a much higher rate. So it should tell you something that Black people are willing to take the risk of getting COVID, because that's how serious we find the issue of police brutality. We are literally stuck between a rock and a hard place, and we've made the decision that this is just the risk that we have to take, because you know what, we're dying anyways. We're going to die anyways. Like, they're killing us. So you might as well do it on your terms, fighting for something that you're passionate about. So I think we really need to consider how serious the problem must be that we're willing to take these risks by going out on the streets and protesting. But a thing I think we should be cautious about, and I've seen people warn about this online too, is we know that there's going to be a second wave and there will be a third wave. And it will be very easy to make a scapegoat of the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests and the resistance movement we're seeing about the country, around the country. But we cannot let that happen, because that's the exact problem that I'm illustrating within my paper. That the way we understand and interpret and the way the media frames things is not always kind or charitable to Black people. And so when that second wave happens, we're very likely to be inundated with images of people at protest, and not all of the white folks who went on vacation for Memorial Day. and not all of the white folks who were standing in line at the Ross down the street for God knows what, because what is Ross got? What is Ross got? And so I think we need to be really careful in evaluating who we think deserves blame, who we're holding accountable, and thinking about what choice were Black people left with in this moment.
What the way that I also think about it is, especially now that we're seeing the health disparities and all of that, and also what Brianna's talking about, there are conservative politicians who are saying, well, maybe Black people don't wash their hands as much, or Black people are they're more obese than other people, even though my friend Cato, they were talking about how actually there isn't that much of a statistical difference between rates of obesity between the Black and white community, but also obesity might not even be the thing. It's social health disparities of hospitals and how doctors treat you and all of that. And so what I think that protesting this pandemic has revealed is, one, that much of America has been a state of dystopia for Black people, for brown people, and Native Americans. And it revealed it so brutally. A friend of mine joked that possibly because there are no longer sports on television and all of that, so much of America can't help but have to look. In a way, I want to even think about this moment of what made the civil rights movement effective in the early days was there wasn't this sort of media saturation where you could just choose your own reality and get away. If there was a bust up, you were going to see it. But of course, conditions have changed with the internet and all of that. But now we're all laser focused on this. And seeing that has been a dystopia for many Black Americans and all of that, I think also a lot of people are seeing what these protesters are showing is that this government does not care about you. They will let you die. And so, if you are already in a state that will let you die, that will just, weigh the balance sheet and be like, how many is an okay number and we just won't talk about it, then it makes sense to be out in the street. At least you're saying, this is not going to save us. In fact, this is what got us in this mess, in the first place. But it also calls attention to, let's not forget about the deep sources of Black political agency behind these protests, and that so much of what has made this nation at least more tolerable has come from Black freedom movements putting their bodies on the line when everyone would say, why can't you all just stay inside? Why can't you just get along? And now I don't want to forget that, because I want to remember that, also this is revealing the deep power that bottom-up movements can have that at least briefly shift things. We're watching politicians actually have to make decisions they probably wouldn't want to make, which is talking about cutting police budgets and all of that. And so we need to remember that. And what I want to end on is, the issue of memory and what Brianna's talking about. When the second and third wave comes, you're going to be inundated with propaganda that's going to tell you, look what these Black people did to us. We need the resources in order to fight that. Because what a lot of Black people are worried about is whether white people are going to get tired of this struggle and be like, can't we just go back to getting along? But we're at an inflection point, especially if you want do we even need to start talking about climate change and how it's, it's bound up in coronavirus? And, I just want to say this last thing. If you want to reform the police, I ask you to think, the police as they're currently configured, will they allow us to actually address the deep problems of climate change with their protection of property and managing a current state of affairs? This is a decisive moment, and we need to remember that and not be like, well, gosh, we're doing this, after 2 months, can we get back to normal? Normal is dystopia. And so these protests are saying it's already been a living death. Are you willing to, move beyond that?
Thank you. So we've now come to the 40-minute mark. So I've got lots more questions for you. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Ryan, and he is going to put questions to you that are coming in from the audience.
Yes, great. Thank you very much. Okay, so our first question comes, it's for Briana, and it comes from Sarah, and it's about appropriation. And the question is about, well, it's sort of, there's an example here which is supposed to, I think, to tease out a distinction. And the question is what you think about the distinction. So the example of appropriation you gave was appropriating Black Lives Matter with Blue Lives Matter. That seems like a case in which the subject matter is sort of the same, like it's an appropriation that is in some ways in response to Black Lives Matter. But what about a case of appropriation where a means of protest or a slogan is appropriated, but just for sort of other kinds of reasons? So the example that Sarah gave was a Pepsi commercial that maybe doesn't appropriate the slogan, but appropriates some images or iconography from protests in order to sell Pepsi products. Do you see that as an act of appropriation? Do you think that's an importantly different kind of appropriation? Do you see it as problematic or differently problematic? Or it's just an invitation to say more about that.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for the question. And it's so funny that you asked because that is literally the example that I use in my paper too, like the Pepsi commercial as an illustration of appropriation. And yes, I think it is conceptual rhetorical theft. And yes, I think it is harmful. We've seen how much capitalism loves a crisis. I don't know about anybody else, but my Facebook right now is dominated by buy this bubble to wear around yourself when you go outside, or here's this thing that's basically a key that you can use to press the ATM buttons. And I think, capitalism taking something for us and using it to sell a product that, and then, I mean, I don't know that this is true of Pepsi, but so many of these companies end up donating to political campaigns that are for people who want to harm us. And so, yeah, I am very suspicious of any companies that appropriate Black Lives Matter to sell their goods. And I do think it's harmful.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so I have a question now for Will, and this question is from Arnell. So could you just say more about Utopia, both the way you're thinking about it and the uses of it, and maybe the perils involved in using it? And in particular, Arnell is thinking about how considering and manifesting the practical sense of utopia is helpful for Blacks who are entrenched in this living death. And this can be harmful for whites who will assume the utopia has arrived and mistake utopia for progress.
Okay, that's a really good question. I thought I was going to go in a different direction because usually in the mid-20th century, the perils of utopia were utopia was simply aligned with Stalinist totalitarianism. And I'm glad we're moving beyond that discourse. So the perils of utopia are the fantasy of completion, right? And so I actually find, to go back to the issue, the static in the radio, really helpful, because this is not about, no utopia will ever arrive. I'm pretty comfortable saying that. Again, future, who knows? And if I'm wrong, boy, would I love to find out I'm wrong. But the reason why it's important for utopia to be a practice is that you're always being attuned to the specific impediments, the specific structures that are preventing whatever is in the static from coming through. And so if you think you've made it, if you think you've done it, then you've lost the practice. And so utopia requires a constant attunement. It's also a hermeneutical comportment to figuring out, interpreting the material structures that are impoverishing us, that are harming us, and understanding that once you get past those structures, that doesn't prevent new social problems from arising. And that's why I think, I shouldn't have read Vox this morning, but somebody on there is just like, defund the police, what about crime and all of that? No one's saying that there won't be social problems. We're asking, what does it mean to attend to those social problems? But also, if I may be a little bit utopian, I'd like to find some new social problems, because these ones have become a bit stagnant. And so for white people who look at utopia as, the way that they butcher MLK's speech, I have a dream of holding hands and all of that, one, that's not, that MLK you remember is not the one you think it is. It's a constant struggle. It's a constant learning of living together and knowing that there are always going to be structures that frustrate that, but the fight is worth it nonetheless. And so there should be something militant about utopia. There should be something that's always challenging us by making us experience what is missing rather than pure satisfaction.
Briana, I have another question about appropriation for you from Miriam. The question is, on your account of appropriation, does Donald Trump count as trying to perform an act of appropriation by scheduling, at least originally, his rally in Tulsa on Juneteenth? Would that count as an act of appropriation, or does it fall somewhere else in your categories, or is it a sort of a different example entirely?
Thanks, Miriam. I think I would need to hear more about why someone would think of this as appropriation. I suppose, honestly, what I think is happening here is maybe I'm just being radical and pessimistic, but I think in doing this, Trump was trying to start a race riot, honestly. Like, I think that was the only real intention. I think he was trying to engineer something that would allow for stereotype confirmation. Like, look at these wild, crazy animals. I was just having a political rally. And I think the choice of Juneteenth and Tulsa were intentional for starting that sort of process. But I can't immediately see why it would count as an instance of appropriation.
Okay, great. There's also a question about stereotype from Ting and Lin. And the question is, do you have any thoughts about how to combat that challenge? Is there something that could be done to combat that sort of move of undermining?
So one thing that you can do retrospectively, so after the fact, is to show just how we evaluate differently the same actions when they're undertaken by white people versus Black people. So in the paper, I say, if you Google and look after the Super Bowl in Philadelphia in 2018, they did riot. They flipped cop cars and set them on fire. The Philadelphia PD, in a preemptive strike, had greased the light pole so that people wouldn't be able to climb them. Spoiler alert, it didn't stop people. It was pretty chaotic. And then in Keene, New Hampshire, they have a pumpkin festival every year, and that was also just utter chaos. More than just people smashing pumpkins, but apparently there were more people injured in the Keene pumpkin riots than in the Ferguson protest, which is a lot. And yet, if you compare media analyses of these events, the people in Keene and Philadelphia were described as revelers, as overzealous fans. But if you then look at how people were discussed with respect to Ferguson, they were described as thugs, as a lynch mob, as criminals, as out of control animals. And I think one thing that helps is to show people those side-by-side comparisons, and then to ask what in our collective imagination allows for Blacks as animals to make sense to us, but doesn't allow us to make sense of that when it's applied to white people for acting the same way. But preemptively, this is actually one of the questions that Simone sent in advance, just thinking about undermining strategies helps you think about how you can preempt their occurrence, which is why I drove so hard on the point that we need to make epistemic changes, not just symbolic changes. Because in a system like ours, where saying something like Blacks are criminals seems irrational, that says that there's a lot of epistemic work that we have to do in changing our associations of Blackness with negatively valenced words. And so thinking about the myths that we tell about our founding, Will pointed that out, like Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. No, he didn't. The Gettysburg Proclamation was great, but it's also the case that he thought that the Black man and the white man in America would never be able to reconcile, and that it was quite possibly best that we should be shipped back to Africa, which would not have made sense because by that time that wasn't home anymore. America was. And so I think actively challenging and dismantling the myths that allow for and prop up white supremacy is the most effective way to challenge stereotype confirmation, by getting really at the root of where those stereotypes come from in the first place.
Can I just say something real quick that's directly responding to that? And this is just like an historical example. So Malcolm X is in a chapter I have on Black nationalism. And if you look at all of his speeches, at least most of his later ones, he always says the so-called Negro. And that was his way of disrupting these inherited stereotypes of who one is. And also saying, that thing is not you. And so his version of Black nationalism was even like speaking to Black people and saying, you look at yourself as a minority. You actually, you take on the comportment of someone who's a minority in the United States, but there's more of you globally than there are here nationally. And so know that about yourself and make those different associations with yourself. And so that's even, a practice that can happen within a stereotype community of them unlearning the impositions that they have internalized.
So, Will, there's a couple questions have come in for you about Utopia and its relationship to hope. So both Jessica and Eric are curious about this, and I'll sort of synthesize the question. So, I mean, ultimately the question is like, what role do you think hope might play with your way of thinking about Utopia? And in particular, earlier you were saying that the sort of conceptual framework of optimism and pessimism, you had this desire to disentangle that from the notion of utopia. Would that also apply to something like hope? And does it have some role in the practice of utopia? What might it look like? And how should we think about hope in general?
I think hope's an interesting affect. And so, again, so much of what I'm trying to do, and I realized, maybe this is a fool's errand, but I want to take words and concepts that, we think we know well, and I want to break them open and say that there's more going on there. And so I think hope has become a rather sort of empty term. If we want to talk about appropriation, I might be getting myself into a little bit of trouble here, but the Obama campaign did not do a great deal for the discourse of hope. I think a lot of people looked at that for many different reasons and said, if this is what hope is, I'll have none of that, thank you very much. But I approach hope differently through, the German philosopher Ernst Bloch, where he actually, argues that hope is sort of fundamental to our subjectivity, that we can't help but anticipate. And so hope isn't about, this sort of passive, well, I know things will turn out well. For him, he wanted to rescue this anticipatory part of our nature and say that it's worth making the risk in saying what one is hopeful for. Maybe that's what I find important. Hope isn't simply a private thing that one feels. If it's militant, you enunciate and say what it is you're hoping for. Come what may. Optimism, pessimism, there are things that are still worth hoping for, that we are still worth driving for. Whether we actually get them or not, who knows? But at least the Black critical tradition I'm a part of, hope wasn't something fanciful. Hope was, a deeply rooted need to solve specific social problems that, a group of people took on for themselves. Hope wasn't bestowed by elites. Hope was, like people, down working, demanding a society and a life of dignity and free from violence. And so I think hope has a role to play insofar as it can spark our passions and clarify what it is that we want. But as soon as it becomes something like, well, I have hope for the future, that's not what I'm talking about.
Briana, there's a question for you now from Christine, who is wondering if you have thoughts on how nodding as non-performative, which I guess is Sarah Ahmed's notion. I wasn't familiar with it, but Christine says that it's wherein someone agrees with what the speaker says as a way of bringing about what that person is calling for. So like nodding at something. Do you see that as a way of serving to undermine resistance? Do you think that is maybe should be added to this list of undermining, or does it fall under one of?
Honestly, I need to think about it more, but I like this idea, especially as it relates to some of the things I've been thinking about in terms of performative allyship or performative wokeness. So these actions that allow people to feel like they care about Black people, but don't actually do anything to improve the material or social or political conditions of Black Americans. And so, yeah, I think I can see it's probably not exactly like the other forms of undermining that I consider, but it's definitely on a scale, I would say. So if you take the types of undermining I'm looking at as really just egregious and disruptive to the aims of protest movements, I'd put nodding somewhere on the right of that scale. where that's something people are doing when they're a little more racially developed. They're not committing these forms of undermining anymore, but they're still not thinking about it in the terms that Will's proposing, where like you have to actually do something and engage in a practice to be moving towards some social change. And so, yeah, I think it would be on the spectrum of undermining.
Okay, Will, we have a question for you that just came in from Tamsin. It says, I'm curious to hear more about the neoliberal capture and the relationship between liberalism and these utopias that you've mentioned. So in thinking about many of the uprisings happening as a kind of utopian space, it seems like they're pretty fragile. And one of the key undermining strategies that we've seen emerge is the promotion of sort of liberal narratives, like, for example, make sure you go out and vote, or versions of respectability politics. Like, this is not what we do here. By some organizers and participants. So I'm just curious what strategies for maintaining and amplifying the utopian potential of uprising is in the face of the undermining narratives that exists here.
I love this question. And this is also why I think it's so important for, and now I'm speaking to, whatever philosophers are here in the philosophical discipline, why it's also so important to take seriously African-American, and broadly speaking Afrikaans, but let's stick with African-American philosophy. The historical roots of a lot of these protest movements, often historically they're remembered as liberal movements, as simply gambits for electoral gain. Sure, sometimes those were tactics, but if we want to come back to the Black Nation, the articulation of the Black Nation is a decidedly anti-liberal project. It was saying, no, the liberal state has failed us. It is illegitimate. No, we need to develop another autonomous space of economic institutions, cultural institutions, political institutions. Again, going back to Henry Highland Garnett and all that, the Black Nation has taken many forms. But what gets lost is that African-American philosophy is not strictly coincided with liberalism, but there has always been this sort of parasitic relationship of trying to feed off of that and turn those utopian energies into simply liberal projects, and in order to make them almost justify the state and say, this actually, look how Black people have overcome. If anything, that gives more legitimacy to the United States project, because look how we're willing to treat our Blacks. Look how we're willing to incorporate them with whatever meager social handouts we are willing to bestow upon them. Though, of course, COVID has revealed we ain't got much of that. And so, yes, there's always a danger. And in the first part of my book, I deal with the role of Black intellectuals like Du Bois, of how do they deal with this danger of co-opting and redirecting these really sort of radical utopian forces, but the ways that Utopia constantly tries to exceed the grasp of a certain kind of liberalism, but it's incredibly fragile. And Du Bois eventually had to rethink the Talented Tenth, because he realized, oh no, it actually kind of destroyed these projects, and they're more interested in incorporation and accommodation rather than true social change. And so the reason why I would just to say once more, the African-American tradition is not a purely liberal tradition, which means that they have a different concept of freedom if we'd be really willing to investigate it, willing to enact it and practice it. Not to say it would be perfect. Again, new social problems might arise, but the attempt to always domesticate it and to make it simply, a spice on the ordinary philosophy pie, I think is dangerous. And it misses so much of the distinction of this tradition.
Well, thank you, Will, and thank you, Briana. There's many, many more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I'm going to pass things back to Simone.
So thank you very much to our two panelists, to William Paris and Briana Toole, for a fantastic discussion. It's been a real privilege to participate in it, and I really want to thank you for your time and your generosity in joining us here today. And I know I say this on behalf of an audience that unfortunately can't conventionally applaud, but I'm sure everyone is giving their applause and hopefully not merely nodding. So thank you very much.